Hi, my name is Dr. Kari Nadeau, and today I'll be talking about what do existing food allergy prevention studies tell us and what does the future hold. Thank you so much for joining us at this IACI PAM NNI Industry Symposium today. I just wanted to show you Michelangelo's shopping list that he had drawn for one of his team members, and you can see here that most of the major allergens are represented. So again, this is a modern problem that years ago people really didn't have to worry about. So I just wanted to underscore that as we think about how to deal with the future. These are my disclosures. You can find them on the slides. And importantly is the rising food allergy prevalence around the world. You can see here that many countries are now reporting their numbers in terms of how many food allergies they have per capita. And the countries in gray just haven't reported their data yet. We hope that good epidemiologically rigorous data will come forward so that we can understand the rate of growing food allergies across the world. But in each of those countries represented, there's a different food allergy that's the #1 food allergy in that country. So for Australia and the United States, it's peanut, but for other countries, it's milk or egg or wheat or hazelnut or walnut or cashew. So it's really important that we understand better as to what's leading to this increase. And when we talk about prevention, we need to really talk about some of the etiological causes. And when we think about prevention, I'm going to specifically talk today, among many potential avenues for prevention, is single food and multiple food introduction. And that's been shown in many growing areas to be able to be a very sufficient method to be able to try to prevent the risk of food allergy sensitization and the risk of food allergies, period. This is a meta-analysis that was published in JAMA in 2016, in which they looked at single food allergenic introductions and the risk of food allergy as found in their studies. And you can see here the majority of studies show a decreased risk ratio over the course of the study in egg allergy introduction early in children and infants, peanut allergy, as well as milk allergy. So these are important concepts. They've been tested time and time over. This is another study that was published by Peters et al. In JACI in Practice in 2019. You can see that milk allergy, when we think about early exposure, it's associated with reduced risk of milk allergy, for example. And that's really important to look at when we think about those that we can introduce early. And it's not at the expense of breastfeeding. It's not at the expense of any other nutrition. This is introduction of early food proteins that don't exclude breastfeeding. And what about other studies? Well, this is the SPADE study that was done in another country in Japan, and they also showed that if early cow's milk formula was added to infant diets, that it also helped reduce the risk of food allergies quite dramatically. So that was at 6 months of age. So early is better, regular feeding is better, small doses are adequate as well. But what about the timing? There's a lot of studies that have occurred to be able to try to understand the best timing of early introduction of foods, either between 0 to 6 months or 7 to 12 months. Any time is okay. There's not a given time that's not okay. However, it looks like, at least preliminarily, that if you can start between about 4 to 6 months at the same time that children are trying to get excited about eating foods that they are not going to choke on, that are solid foods, table foods, and that parents are starting to experiment with these foods as well, and the baby can explore different textures, it looks like 4 to 6 months is probably the most beneficial time period, and that's what's been shown here in the 2017 child study out of Canada. In addition, our colleagues in Australia, Dr. Burgess et al., published this paper in 2019 looking at the observational studies introducing solids before 4 months, and it's really important that these studies have shown that between 4 to 6 months is a helpful time to be able to introduce foods early. Now, what about multiple food allergen approaches? Because to the body. It's all proteins to the body. It sees and digests different proteins, and those get taken up by the immune system as peptides. So the body itself isn't classifying whether or not these peptides are from all these different foods. To the body, they're seen as peptides. And so you can, in fact, give babies the different foods at the same time to be able to see if they could reduce the risk of food allergy and total. We know that by giving egg allergen, for example, you're not going to get a benefit for peanut allergy, decreased risk. So you have to have specificity engendered in what you introduce. And this was done in the EAT study that was published in the New England Journal by my colleagues in London. Michael Perkin is the first author, and importantly, they showed that per protocol, if you followed the exact specifications of the protocol, that it reduced the risk of food allergy by about 67%. And that's important, but it was very difficult, and the author should explain this as well, that to be able to make a child eat and to have the families eat that large proportion of food every other day or 3 times a week, lots of patients didn't necessarily comply, so it was hard to analyze the data. But when you look at other data in retrospective studies epidemiologically, for example, in the Pasteur study that was published by Rodoux et al., you can see that diversification score, so the more diversity of foods that the population had in their diet in infancy and toddlerhood, that reduced the risk of food allergy quite dramatically in that group, as well as other atopic conditions. So that's really important. There's something about getting all those proteins in at the same time and getting our immune system used to being educated for these different proteins and peptides. In a very independent way, Dr. Kari Nadeau published this study in January 2020 from the Isle of Wight, showing that there was a 96% reduction in food allergies over the first 10 years of life with the consumption of 8 allergenic foods by 12 months of age. So that's really excellent to know that, again, this diversification early and often is very important, and that's been shown time and time again by many independent groups. There was another study that came out of Northwestern University in which a food product that was 10 different foods were synchronously given and a small teaspoon of powder. And with that, they did a 28-day randomization controlled study where supplement was given to about 360 infants, another placebo where they were blinded were given to another about 330 infants, and they were administered 1 packet, 1 tablespoon of the placebo or food supplement a day. So this is different from the EAT study because that was done not every day. It was given as an instruction sheet to like maybe 3 times a week. But I believe, and the data will show you, that perhaps daily feeding is going to be an improvement to be able to decrease the dose and give something daily to have people remember to have this be given to their children. Every infant was observed with a diary as well as an e-diary 2 hours after the feeding, and they recorded any allergic reactions or symptoms. There was also a long-term study that some families were asked to move forward with, over 600, then converted from the original study into a multi-month period. So there was a lot of data obtained on using this mixture of 10 potential food protein allergens in the baby's diet. There was 94% monthly adherence using the daily diaries, and the diaries also were food intake diaries, and they were done to assess diversity of their own diets. We wanted to make sure that children could, and in the end, enjoy food and table food like their families were eating, and that is our end goal. So this was published by Dean Hall, and what I also want to emphasize is that there was no increased risk of any safety. That part of the reason why we did this safety is by giving 10 potential food allergens at once to infants that didn't have any food allergies. You want to make sure that there was no induction of any rashes or eczema, and that actually was not the case at all. In fact, the placebo group potentially did worse, and it's important to know that these other symptoms were obtained through rigorous GCP guidelines for clinical studies. So again, these were large studies, about 300 in each group, and this is the safety data. And then what about the daily diary intake data? Well, what was really interesting about the study is that in the end, the parents felt very comfortable introducing table foods into the diet, especially if they knew that their child had received the active arm. So that was exciting to see. No one had an allergic reaction greater than 6 months of age to any of the foods if they had been in the active arm. And then the long-term groups that completed over 11 months on supplement, you can see even there they were very adequately prepared for being able to transition to table foods, and a lot of the families felt really excited to be able to diversify their diets and start table foods early and not live in fear of allergies. And no one developed a doctor's diagnosis of food allergy during this follow-up. So what about the serving sizes? We've talked about timing, we've talked about the need for multiple food introduction, not just single food, and what about the serving sizes? Well, it's important to put this into context in which the USDA specifically has a calorie intake recommendation, and we know that for Europe, this might be something that is provided as a guideline. Across the US, as many other countries are dealing with issues around diabetes type 2 and obesity and non-communicable diseases. At the same time, we have to be careful as to what we're feeding ourselves and our children and infants. And so the USDA has put together these energy requirements and made sure that people are educated, and pediatricians as well, and allergists. We should also be educated on the fact that there are specific calorie restrictions that we should be limiting on the infant so that there's a reduced risk of using foods that are not nutritious, or there's a reduced risk of increased calories. And so with that, we need to make sure that we have serving sizes that don't increase satiety and that aren't too many calories to be able to exclude the use of breastfeeding or exclude the use of any kind of table food which the child might be trying with their family. So with that in mind, other countries as well have tried early introduction of foods at lower doses than the EAT and the LEAP study, and it's important to know that this study was published, the PETITE study, in which they initially used a 50 milligram dose of heated powder per day at 6 to 9 months, and then they followed it with increasing the serving size. And that's very doable, and this is really exciting to know that this is possible. These were high-risk infants, and you can see the dramatic decrease in the prevalence of egg allergy in this group. So very exciting news that you don't necessarily have to use high serving sizes to be able to get a good effect. And how do we know that? Well, we also have other data that is being looked at and submitted and reviewed, and it's important to know that when you actually introduce different foods at the same time in culture, that you get a beneficial effect from dendritic cells, from biomarkers. Biomarkers aren't the same thing, I know, as doing a food challenge, which I'll show you data on shortly, but it is important to know that when you give multi-foods versus single foods, there's actually an activation of dendritic cells that increase IL-10, increases the capacity to make IgG4 isotype switching, and decreases IL-4, and that decrease in IL-4 reduces specific IgE production by B cells. So what we were really fascinated about is how different the multiple food fared compared to just giving the same cells single food. So again, we think that by diversifying the peptides, by diversifying how they get exposed to MHC complexes, they produce more they induce more polyclonal populations, and that will increase the ability compared to the single allergens, which induce more of an oligoclonal population. And in general, you can get a benefit for long-term efficacy. So what happened to be able to take this in vitro work and move it forward in vivo is at Stanford, my group and I worked really hard to be able to create a product that had at least 10 foods in the mixture. And we actually wanted to test prospectively, not through retrospective modeling, but prospectively, what dose might be the best to be able to give to the children to best prevent the risk of food allergy as determined by a gold standard food challenge. And so what we did was we had a control group, a single food protein group, those individuals that just received 2 proteins, those that received the 10 food protein mix at 30 milligrams each versus 300 milligrams each versus even more. And so we wanted to test these different doses and see what worked the best. So we performed a study, and I'll show you the infant groups in particular because we've been talking about infants today. We randomized 180 infants into singles, doubles, mixtures of 10, and then a control. And there were about 45 in each of these groups. And in total, they took 300 milligrams a day. Not every other day, not 3 times a week, but daily. And that's really important. And what's also very instructive is that for the doubles, they either took peanut milk, milk egg, peanut egg, or the singles took food individually. And there were relatively low numbers, only 15 in each of these, but this was a pilot study to be able to get a signal as to whether or not any of these different serving sizes had a better or worse effect. And so you can see here the ethnicities and the age and the eczema rates. Many of them did have eczema. We did not exclude based on eczema, and we followed eczema throughout the study. And about 50% were from high-risk families. Risk was determined by Dr. Katie Allen's definition of high risk, and so we wanted to make sure we were rigorous. The age groups represented here are between 2 and 12 months. And so what we did was we challenged with the actual mixture itself as a first screener, and this is what this data shows. And this is follow-up after the 1-year eating study. Children took it daily or every other day. Some of them missed doses in ages less than 12 months, and they took it for 1 year. And then they didn't take it at all. We wanted to introduce table foods and get them excited about eating real foods, the control group as well. And they started to be able to come in and do oral food challenges after about 2 to 4 years. So a lot of these children were 3 years old to 5 years old. And it's important to see, this is the intent to treat population, not the per protocol population. And you can see here that if they were a control group, unfortunately, 52% did have a reaction to a mixture of 15 different foods, and we went up to 8 grams in this particular food challenge. In milk, egg, and peanut, there was about 50 to 60% reactivity, and then it's important here that here we had about 30% reactivity in those that had the doubles, but in those that had the mixtures, they had very little reactivity. And it's, in fact, the lowest dose, the 30 milligrams per unit of protein in the mixture, had the best outcome. So all of these were shown to be statistically significant, but this is a signal, and we need to do more studies. But we're very excited to know that we did see some differences. Well, what about the biomarkers? You can see here in the specific IgG4 to IgE ratio that when we looked just for peanut, that children that the control actually had reduction over time. Milk obviously did not have an effect. We wouldn't have expected it to have an effect via the peanut in early introduction. The peanut obviously did. But what's really interesting is that once you started adding the mixtures, even though the same amount of peanut was given in each of these, you see a better increase with the mixture. So again, that possible mechanism of the increased IL-10, increased dendritic cell exposure, and increased conversion of IgG4 to IgE ratios. In the same conditions, you could ask, well, what about milk? We did the same thing. We looked at milk over time. The controls went down, which was, again, unfortunately, but expected. But in the people that got peanut or egg, you didn't see any changes in milk. But with the mixtures, you saw a dramatic increase in the milk IgG4 to IgE, even better than if they had done an equivalent dose of milk alone. And the same thing happened with cashew. None of the singles represented cashew, so of course we didn't expect any differences in their IgG4 to IgE ratio, but the mixtures did, and we saw improvement in cashew as well. So what about the control groups in all these studies? Well, I do worry about them because lack of early introduction can lead to impaired immune responses, unfortunately, and that was shown by our colleagues in Australia in a recent study with egg in which they looked over time and they showed that longitudinal egg-specific regulatory T and B cell development is improved upon when foods are introduced early in either high-risk or low-risk infants. And that's really important because we want to educate the immune system. We want to be able to have children feel comfortable eating foods at the table and not have to live a life of fear if they get diagnosed with food allergy. So we think this really interesting synergy between the dendritic cells, activation of the IL-10 pathway, and regulatory T and B cells is going to be important for the future. This is another example of how the lack of early introduction can lead to impaired immune responses. Here's where, unfortunately, the peanut avoidance group in the LEAF study, you can see that over time, just doing nothing actually is worse than doing something. And you can see here the increase, not even just a plateau, but an increase over time for every month that that child was on the planet, and how they increased their peanut wheel size as well as peanut-specific Ig. And these are for children that either had a sensitivity to peanut coming into the study or did not. So what about the future? What are our summary after today's talk? Well, number one, there's no reason to test infants for allergies before introducing diverse foods. It is possible, given the rate of food allergies, that children will learn that they have food allergies, and parents will learn that their children have food allergies by giving them table food, just like any parent would potentially find out that way, that they have to go through a regular pediatric appointment, then an allergy appointment. But again, those are very rare. In our current studies with the mixture of foods, only 0.004% react, and that's really important to be able to think about how to make sure we introduce safely and we introduce appropriately and we introduce early with regular daily feedings of small serving sizes to make sure that it's safe. But we know that some infants do have food allergies before they start eating any food, and so oftentimes they have a rash and they can get then moved forward in the system to be able to get a diagnosis just like they would for any table food introduction. Babies with normal, dry, and any degree of eczema can start diversifying their foods. Eczema is not an exclusionary principle. Eczema or atopic dermatitis is not worsened by introducing diverse foods. That's been now shown and published. In fact, it typically gets better over time compared to a control group. Larger serving sizes do not seem to be needed, but daily, not weekly, small servings seem optimal and age appropriate without going above the calorie intake recommendations. Data today showed that it is safe to introduce diverse foods, and no one has developed food allergies after stopping and then starting again in any of our studies. And then starting small servings of diverse foods can be done together with breastfeeding or formula feeding consistent with WHO guidelines. So thank you very much for your attention. The kinestic studies are still needed and are important to understand how immunotherapy and prevention is working. It is a possibility. Prevention and diversity of diet and early regular introduction at small serving sizes and doses are important. Some biomarker assays show promise, and we'll need to continue to monitor our patients and families. Thank you.